Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Happy Practice Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Sierra, and today I am joined by not one, but two fantastic guests who are some of the smartest people I know. I'm joined by Dr. Hendrik Lai and Miss Genevieve Poppe. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Good to have you guys here. Now, for those of you that are familiar with Hendrik and Genevieve, Dr. Lai offers invaluable guidance to doctors who are navigating the dual roles of healers and business owners. He has extensive experience as a dentist, a practice owner, a private equity advisor, and a global business leader who helps his clients to achieve sustainable growth and build rewarding businesses. And Genevieve has over 20 years of experience in the dental industry. She's established herself as a leading dental practice management figure and a consultant across the U.S. She's the founder of Poppe Practice Management and is a former owner and manager of a 7-location practice group, and that's where she honed her skills as a practice manager and a business leader. Today, I want to talk about economics and kind of the economic state of healthcare. And in the duration of this interview, we're going to go over some things that are challenging and complex right now. I don't think anyone's oblivious to the current economic reality. I want to start out with the positives, though. What are some things that are going well for healthcare right now, and what are some opportunities for, particularly people that are in private practice?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question, Adam. I think, healthcare as a whole remains a largely recession-proof industry. We sort of understand that we're moving against some tough economic headwinds. However, population growth, increased uptake of insurance, and certain legislative changes in the insurance landscape provides a lot of opportunities for dentists, for optical groups, as well as veterinarians. So I think that in terms of overall macroeconomics, the conditions for healthcare still remain favorable. We still see considerable consolidation in the industry, and I think that the consolidation does present significant opportunities for both the aggressive amalgamators as well as the adaptive survivors. So, there's two groups in this particular macroeconomic environment that have significant opportunities where they can leverage not only large-scale isolating mechanisms, but smaller-scale isolating mechanisms which larger groups can't take advantage of. So, on the whole, the net is that healthcare remains a very, very profitable, very, very high potential area.
Yeah. So, to Hendrik's point, there's never a shortage of opportunity in our industry. And for those who are on the private practice side, sort of fighting that consolidation, it's the time to be nimble. It's the time to be creative. It's the time to take advantage of the way that you can move quickly in ways that some of those big groups can't make those moves and differentiations in the industry.
It's become very clear that from a macroeconomic standpoint, we are entering a phase of an industry shakeout, largely in sense of the consolidation. So we moved through a significant maturity phase during the recent 10 to 15 years in the healthcare industry, and that's sort of really been characterized by a decreased number of active market participants. So we're seeing a reduced number of players in the space, and that's a direct result of consolidation in the area. We're likely to see a seismic shakeout occur probably within the next 7 to 10 years is what a lot of the modeling suggests. And this is going to be driven by governmental policies, local jurisdictional legislative changes to the insurance landscape, and deregulation in the scope of practice. Certainly in a number of healthcare areas, we're seeing healthcare scope creep. For example, in Minneapolis, dental assistants are now able to be trained to give local anesthesia. So we're going to see an increased use of dental auxiliaries, which are going to drive costs down associated with healthcare provision, as well as, in theory, increase the level of competition, which should be good for consumers and should be good for disruptive innovation.
Love that. So you covered several different things there, and I love that you led me into the, kind of what comes next. As you look in 2024, what are some of the economic headwinds that practices are facing these days? Whether they're a doctor who's an owner or as somebody who's working at a practice, what are some of the challenges right now that you're seeing in the market?
Well, I think your average patient, your average household is struggling with less discretionary dollars to spend, right? So things that aren't absolutely necessary are taking a back seat a little bit more than they were just a few years ago. So, we have to get creative with how we help people proceed with things that maybe hit their pocketbook a little harder than they used to.
Yeah, definitely agree with that, Genevieve. And I think that, beyond the, patient considerations, significant pain points exist in human capital development, human capital acquisition. It's becoming exceedingly difficult for us to find qualified people, to keep qualified people, and to develop qualified people within different practice areas, be that dental, be that optical, be that veterinary. Another area that represents a significant pain point for many healthcare organizations is standardization of revenue cycle management. Particularly as consolidation occurs and bringing in new affiliates or new groups into the fold of the core business, it's integrating different processes, different cultures, different personality types into that core business. And a real driver of that has been, revenue cycle management. It's the idea being that how do you integrate a office or a group that's largely been decentralized with revenue cycle functions done at the front desk versus into a larger group where that revenue cycle management function is largely centralized and performed by a central business office or central billing office. So it's really that talent acquisition and standardization of revenue cycle management, which I see as being the true difficult internal pain points that we have to sort of overcome this year.
Very true, which loops right back around to the continuous pain point of staffing and hiring people and shifting their roles in those occasions. And sadly, at least speaking very firsthand for dentistry, but I imagine it's similar in nearly every setting, is that we have a lot of burnout in our industry. We lost a lot of people in the pandemic. We brought in a lot of people who have very little experience. And so there's an experience gap in almost every office you go to that has rookies and veterans, and they're not great at bridging the middle. They want help, but we're not good at training people up.
Mm-hmm.
And so I hardly know of an office that isn't struggling very firsthand with really getting their team in the right seats, operating effectively in their roles.
When you both work with many different practices of many different types, the practices that are more or less thriving in terms of their staffing situation, what are they doing differently and what are they doing well that other people can replicate?
Yeah. I always say, like, one of the most first important things, but it's so obvious, but we're not good at it, is having really clear role definition. So knowing what you're hiring for before you hire. Dental offices, I joke, are one of the only businesses that basically just say, we're busy, let's hire another person to be busy with us. And as a result, we can't hire the right person because we don't even know what that person should ultimately do. There's a lot of territory that's hard to navigate if you don't clarify for the people already in your organization what the expectations of their role are. And then that makes it really challenging to bring in new people to be successful in that environment. So very simply, a good org chart with good role clarity is sort of the starting point for successful teams.
Yeah, I agree with that, Genevieve. And I also think another aspect of it is very clear alignment of strategy, tactics, and operations. So, from a generic strategy standpoint, there are 3 generic strategies we can have. 1 is cost leadership, 2 is differentiation, and 3 is focus. So we've been sort of focusing on that human capital development, human capital growth, human capital acquisition. In the case of a cost leadership sort of model, the imperative would be to align being the cost leader for a particular given level of quality with the type of capital needed. So is it a replacement of human capital with technological capital? So where we can't get qualified capital, we can't retain qualified capital, in order for a organization to be the cheapest, for want of a better word, for a given level of quality, is it retaining a small core group of human capital and then augmenting their capabilities with technological capital? So something like Weave or something similar, or is it just replacing that human capital entirely with technological capital? because, technology, even though it's got initial startup costs and initial capital costs, over the longer term, operationalization of, technology enablement is certainly far cheaper than, relying on human capital. So I think, the groups that are doing it well have very, very clear alignment of their strategy, their tactics, and the operations, which includes the decision of the type of capital to deploy and where to deploy it.
One of the things that goes along hand in hand, really, with any economic situation and any economic discussion is, do I sell my practice? Whether that's just, the opportunity's right, or the practitioner is just at that stage of life where it makes sense that they want to sell.
Okay.
I know that you, Genevieve, have worked a lot in acquisitions and brokering and et cetera. What are you seeing right now in terms of practices that are, being able to be sold, and what are people looking for?
Yeah. Anytime I'm asked this question, the first thing I say is you should have a plan. You should have a timeline. I see way too many doctors just sort of get to a point of exhaustion or fatigue or now I'm ready, and then decide they want to sell their practice, and they leave so much money on the table by not just doing a few simple things well at the end of their career. And so they go into sort of what I call harvest mode, and they start working a little less, and they stop investing, and they start diagnosing Crohn's on every posterior tooth, and they just kind of try to take out of their practice what they can at the end, and then just figure, I'll just get this multiple from my practice, right? And there's just this very simple idea about it, and especially from the private practice side. But DSOs are very smart about what they're looking for, and even on private practice buyers have certain criteria now. It's much easier to evaluate a practice than it used to be in terms of what indicates healthy practice, what indicates room for me to grow this thing. And so the first thing I say is don't just wait until you're done to call your broker. Like, that's the worst mistake you can make. You'd much rather sell your practice on an upward trajectory than a downward one. If you could just be smart about setting that timeline and saying, I really want to be done by this year, you can make so much better plans, whether that's an associate or preparing yourself for sale to a group. And those two buyers look for different things, right? But I think that a lot of, especially coming as a sort of a smaller buyer, right? When I was looking at more private practices, I think they tend to just think that they're going to get a percentage of their collections and that's it. And they're not thinking about how they've kept their facility up. They're not thinking about, have they shown growth in new patients? Have they shown any growth other than just harvesting treatment out of their existing patient base in the final years? And Hendrik can probably speak so much more to this on the DSO side. But the number one thing I say is, if you're thinking about it, work with somebody to get a plan. Do not wait until you are done. That's like the kiss of death in transition.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that sentiment, that the inevitability is that there has to be an exit, whether it's an exit to a DSO or a corporate entity, and an exit to an associate, whether you just work in your practice until you have a heart attack and die and don't care anymore. There's going to be an exit at some point. And waiting until the exit is forced upon you rather than planning for the exit is one of the biggest mistakes you can make. And I think one of the things that people have to understand is that what a buyer really looks for ultimately, beyond the emotional buyer, the buyers are actually buying cash flow. And the key element that buyers are considering is, what is my ability, or what is the risk that I won't be able to maintain this cash flow that I'm buying? So an example would be, if you're a super GP practice that has got massive cash flow because you're doing 30 molar endos with post-core crowns and all on 4 dentistry, or really, really more complex specialist level focused dentistry that your average provider is unlikely to be able to provide, the risk, and that particularly, what we call key man risk or key person risk, is fairly high, that whoever buys your business won't be able to maintain that level of cash flow. And that becomes even more magnified when it's not being sold to a dentist or to another provider.
Right.
When a corporate comes in, whether it's a DSO or another sort of corporate structure, the corporate entity itself is not a provider. The corporate entity itself can't actually generate that cash flow. So the consideration will be, from your processes, from your systems, from your HR structure, from your ability to maintain and cut costs and, well, ideally grow revenue of maintaining that level of cash flow. So it's really a consideration of how do you de-risk a potential buyer where that cash flow drop is unlikely to occur or less likely to occur. So remember, the key takeaway, it's about risk management and de-risking the buyer as they purchase your practice.
Right. And to that point, like a common thing I'm seeing now, you probably see this too, is I see people who are starting to think about retirement will just go and drop every direct insurance participation because they're not going to take insurance write-offs. They're just going to only do fee-for-service dentistry at the end, which is fine, except that in a lot of cases, especially if you're likely to sell to a DSO, that's not necessarily appealing to them. They're turning into sort of that figurehead practice that Hendrik's talking about, where they're just sort of a high-end, high-level provider collecting fee-for-service, and they think that that's going to be highly valuable in the marketplace. And unless they have sort of a buyer in mind or a specific person lined up that can take over that kind of practice, it actually hurts them in their actual exit.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I think that elements around that kind of practice, particularly with patient growth and net active patient growth, particularly. Yeah. Genevieve mentioned that a lot of sellers in that kind of position go into harvest mode and they put crowns or sort of onlays or on all the posterior teeth and are doing a lot of really high-end oral rehabilitation work. The reality is, unless there's a new net active patients coming into the business, there's no more dentistry to do on these on the patients that exist in the business, because the reality is, how many oral rehabilitations does one person need in their lifetime? So unless you're getting that constant flow through, the risk of not being able to maintain that free cash flow is very, very significant.
It's really sad because they feel like they're handing off this beautiful restorative practice, which they are, except all the patients are restored. And they haven't focused on growing new patients because we only want people who don't care about their insurance. And so they really shrink their active patients. They restore all the patients they have, but they'll say to a seller, but I produced $1.8 million last year. Just that the likelihood within that practice that you'll do it again is slim. So that's just one situation, but it's a common thing I'm seeing lately.
It's a really good call out, and I really appreciate the perspective. One of the things I love that you said, Hendrik, was you need to make a plan before a plan is forced upon you. Human beings in general don't like to think about and confront difficult topics. It sounds like what you're suggesting, that one of the best favors that we can do to our future selves is to start planning now for, hey, even if that's years down the line, what would an exit look like, and how can I make sure that there's a plan in place? So to that point, if somebody's starting to go through that process, what are some things that they should be aware of?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is to ask yourself, who do you want to exit to, and what is your harvest period? Because if you're exiting to a corporate entity, or you want to exit to an associate, you want to hand your practice down to your kids, you just want to sell it for scrap value. All of those need a very, very specific strategy and processes and systems in order to maximize the exit. So if you want to sell things for scrap, the way you structure your financial statements, the way you sort of structure your balance sheet specifically, will be significant in the optimal value you get for your plant and equipment. If you want to exit to an associate, creating systems and processes around culture, creating systems and processes around autonomy becomes much more important than it would be if you were selling to a DSO, where the key driver is going to be free cash flow.
If I can interject on that point, if you want to sell to a private party, have a game plan for what that transition actually looks like. The number of associateships I see started with, we can talk about partnership eventually. And then they fall apart because we can't decide at the front end. Like really having that decided out for yourself. Once I find a partner, this will be the time frame they can buy in. This is how much they can buy in. This is how much I can offer. Like laying that out before it's an emotional or hard or difficult conversation is like a fatal flaw I see in so many associateship transitions. It's so much easier to decide now what that timing is, rather than I'll see how I feel as we go along.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case, to be sort of upfront about how you want to exit, or do you truly want to exit. One of the other things I like to encourage people to do is to undertake, this can be right at the very start of your career or at regular intervals throughout your practice ownership life, is to undertake a self-diligence exercise. Now, this is putting yourself in a buyer's shoes and conducting the due diligence that a buyer would be conducting on your practice should you choose to sell it. This allows you to sort of, determine any loopholes which might exist, any shortfalls which a buyer may see that could reduce the valuation that you could receive from your business. The other big benefit of this is that when it comes time to sell, you have all the data that you would need in order to facilitate a sale. There's a saying in transitions and transactions, is that time kills deals. So the key is to minimize the amount of time that that buyers are looking at during their due diligence, waiting for documentation, waiting for data. So that's one of the best things that people can do for themselves as they're preparing a plan for exit.
One of the things I think that goes undervalued in the economic state of a practice is actually the team. Where this is the Happy Practice podcast, so I feel like you've got a statistic for everything. So is there any way to quantify, like, what is the ROI of a happy, high-performing team?
Yeah, we're actually definitely seeing that come into play as a key criteria that are being assessed, is the longevity of a team and the willingness of a team to stay on post-transaction. What I'm seeing with my transaction information and people I'm working with in that area is that where we've got constant turnover of team, which increases risk. We're talking about risk management here. People are knocking 1 to 2 basis points off the valuation of a transition, because the risk associated with the team and the risk associated with the dentist not being able to maintain that cash flow because of changes in dental assistants, changes in inexperience within front desk personnel becomes a problem. Certainly there are ways to mitigate that. One is to create an awesome corporate culture to encourage people to stay, or 2 is to drive for technological enablement to either augment that human capital or replace it, so that that risk is now mitigated.
Right. Less people dependent. I've transitioned teams firsthand as the new boss, right? As I bought your doctor's practice and now I'm here. There's a lot of things I learned about how not to do that. That could be an entirely different episode.
Could be a book.
But what I think is, again, going back to the idea for these selling doctors to have a plan, something I can tell you that isn't as measurable, but I've watched happen over and over again, is because a lot of doctors don't decide ahead of time the steps of their exit out of something. They're more emotional than they anticipate, right? They're more emotional about their actual stepping out of the office and moving on from it than they think they will be. So, for instance, I always tell the story of I had a doctor cry when I changed the wallpaper in the bathroom because his daughter had picked it out in kindergarten. They're attached to these practices in a very real way, and they do themselves a huge favor to have these are my 10 steps to exit, so that I don't have to make these decisions in the moment. Because to the team point, those teams love their doctors in many cases. They absorb the doctor's feelings about the transition. They get very defensive of it, and then they inadvertently set up failure for the next person coming in. And so it's not just about the planning side, but having a plan helps you take emotion out of something that's going to be unexpectedly emotional.
Those are some really good blind spots, I think, and opportunities, things that people should be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
In general, bringing it all back together as we look at, the economic impact for every practice in today's day and age, whether they're wanting to sell or whether they're just getting started. What are some best practices in at a time that maybe someone's struggling with insurance, or maybe somebody's struggling with bringing in new patients? Maybe they're struggling to get off the ground, or they're struggling with staffing, like we talked about. what are some of the basics of best business practices that they should go back to in those situations that are universal?
Those are such broad and different things, right? I always say that we can get into all of there's so much we can look at. There's so many pieces we can evaluate in our success, but essentially you have to be good at just a few things. One is getting new patients to come in. So how you manage your very first inquiry on the phone. Two, you have to be good at getting them to accept treatment, right? And following through with that. And to that end, being comfortable at finding financial solutions with people, not just presenting information and letting them decide if. And then the third thing you need to do is get them to pay their bill and come back and bring their family. Right? It's really 3 simple steps. You have to have all 3 working at the same time. But each one of those things are simple in theory and hard in execution.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Genevieve said. And I certainly, from a broader sort of business standpoint, the companies that are thriving, the companies that are doing well in this, somewhat challenging sort of environment economic environment we happen to be in, are the ones that have very, very clear alignment of their strategy, their tactics, and operations. What I believe is that set a very, very clear vision, because vision is where you want to be, what you want to achieve. It's very, very aspirational. But the key is that your vision gives rise to your mission. Your mission is, what do we do and who do we do it for? Your mission gives rise to your strategy. This is our generic, very much, what is our valuable competitive position here? What do we do absolutely better than anyone else or better than anyone else? What is it that's difficult for our competitors to replicate that makes us the go-to solution? Now, whether that is cost leadership, whether that's focus, or whether that's differentiation, it's really a combination of capabilities, values, and your opportunities that you can see in the marketplace. But the key thing is that your strategy gives rise to your tactics. And this is where a lot of operators and a lot of people tend to live. We tend to sort of let our tactics try to drive our strategy. And if you read what Sun Tzu said, that strategy without tactics is the longest route to victory, but tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. So there's got to be very, very clear alignment between your strategy and your tactics. And ultimately, those tactics roll down into operations where, that's where we talk about, getting new patients in. That's where we talk about treatment plan conversions and how we do that. So it's the why, the what, and then our how. So what I'm seeing is that there's got to be very, very clear alignment between all of those things, because if there's any mismatch, it creates a degree of cognitive dissonance that creates confusion for potential customers, creates confusion for staff members, and creates confusion for potential buyers down the track. And as the saying goes, a confused buyer, confused customer becomes somebody else's customer.
Mic drop. No, I think it's a perfect way to end it. And I think you guys gave some very actionable things to take away. And I know that I learned a lot, and I think the people listening to this will too. Any last minute thoughts that you'd want to close with on the current economic state of healthcare?
Well, I think despite all the sort of naysayers and the challenges that we face, the reality is that healthcare remains a very robust industry. It remains an industry that is going to be somewhat economically sound and resilient through whatever is thrown at us. The simple reality is that people get sick. There's always going to be an unlimited unlimited amount of demand that's going to be pulled through healthcare. I also think that is a very exciting time for us as we move through this shakeout phase. The next part of the business sort of life cycle is a new annealing phase. This is where new technologies come to bear. This is where a new dominant technology, which will be, in my mind, largely driven by artificial intelligence and technology, will set the course for the next 30, 40 years of healthcare. So while we experiencing a wane in the short term, the long-term prospects for healthcare and healthcare economics look absolutely brilliant.
In total contrast to Hendrik. always go back to the people side, right? At the end of the day, no matter what technology we can deploy, we're taking care of people, right? And people do business with people they like. Patient experience will always matter. How people feel when they leave us will always matter. And I feel just a little bit of an alarming trend in the way that we sort of like to blame patients for their choices rather than our own inability to communicate and connect with them. And so when I hear things like these patients will only do this or our patients this, and we put these big generalizations on problems that every practice is hitting in terms of case acceptance or getting patients to move forward with things. Let's just remember at the end of the day, we're here to take care of humans and do our best for them.
Love it. Well, thank you both for your insights, and thanks for sharing all this with us. And thank you to our listeners for joining us today. That is all for this episode. Until next time, stay happy. Take care.